Hello, everyone. Welcome to part one of Maxwell Render Basics. So before we start, I want to point out a few things on the Maxwell Render website where you can find certain things. So this is the main Maxwell Render website. And a lot of the stuff that you can find are either in support or in resources. Resources is where you'll find the materials library, which is the Maxwell library. And that is, if you click on it, it'll bring you to this Maxwell Render Resources website where you can find a lot of the materials and skies and things like that, HDR and maps. Okay? The other thing to maybe, if you want to kind of understand a little bit better, here, if you go to support and support center, you'll find a lot of the documentation that's related to both. If you click on documentation, it will tell you, okay, this is for version 3, and most of, the issues that are associated with Maxwell Render, you can find explanations here. Some of which I will be showing you. There's also a knowledge base FAQ, for some of the more specific errors and things like that you can look up if you're actually eventually, further down the line, you have some trouble with it, with installation, etc., right? So we'll be touching on some of those pages, some of these pages in particular, specifically. But if you want to take a look, you can look at the products, Maxwell Render Suite, and look at, for example, its features, and you'll kind of get a big overview of how the rendering program works and why what its advantages are. Okay, now I want to point out as well, if we look at the Canva site, there is let me hide these real quick. So for the week, there are two PDFs that I've uploaded. These are from slightly older versions, but I would say 99% of the material still applies. So the first is actually a large Maxwell Render, I guess, manual. It looks like this. Okay, and this basically covers in much more detail a lot of the fundamentals or the basic concepts behind a lot of the settings, basically, right? I mean, it explains in a lot more detail some things. For example, the idea of the camera, the field of view or the focal point, how the diaphragm works, right? Cameras in Maxwell Render are treated like as real physical cameras. So settings like exposure, f-stop, and these things will actually affect your image, and explains a lot of the environmental settings, how the sky works, things like that, right? So this is actually a pretty good reference if you're trying to understand what some of the settings do, and it'll actually tell you, especially in these sections that are highlighted in red, what to do and what not to do in many cases. Okay, so treat this as a resource. Eventually, if you start getting into some of the more advanced options that are associated with this, then you can actually look into some of this, especially in terms of the materials. The materials are can get pretty complicated, but you can do really interesting things with them. The material editor is very robust, but it takes a little while to learn, basically, right? So that's this sort of render manual. But then there's also a specific file for the Rhino plugin, right? This is also a slightly older version, but a lot of what you'll see, there's a quick start, so step by step, which is actually a little bit similar to what we'll be doing in a little bit with the file that I'll be showing you guys. But these basically cover all the settings that you can find within the Maxwell for Rhino plugin itself. Okay, so a lot of this, there's a lot of stuff here. These are just like, look at them as a sort of reference file if you can't figure something out, then actually searching in here or the main sort of Maxwell render manual might be a good idea. Okay, so get that out of the way. All right, so to start out, we'll actually use this file that you've seen. This is called the torusnot.3dm. Okay, and the first thing to probably check in your case is to check that your current renderer is set to Maxwell for Rhino. Okay, and as always, the majority of the Maxwell settings you can find basically here in the scene manager. All these others are basically, a lot of these are standalones that you can pull up, like the material editor, which is its own standalone, but they can be accessed through other places. So, this is the main thing that you really will be using. Okay, so if I just press render just to see what happens with this file, you'll see that it exports, right? So what's happening is Maxwell is actually taking your scene geometry, meshing it, and sending it out to the render, which is over here. And as you can see, the characteristic of how Maxwell works is that it is a sort of progressive render. So you'll see the entirety of the image as it goes, and it gets clearer and clearer as it clears out, basically, right? And that's something that you'll see in the description. And I'll actually close this. In rendering in Maxwell, this page, which gives you a pretty good idea of basically the idea of sample levels, where the same image basically gets from the sort of noisy, unresolved situation to clear and clear as you go along. Now, the idea, especially for exterior renders, at least for us, is that somewhere around this sample level, or SL12, right, is basically should be good enough. All right. As you kind of move up in sample levels, as you see in the description here, each new sample level takes 1.5 times as long to reach as the previous one, right? So it gets basically proportionally longer for each sample level as you kind of go along. Okay, so keep that in mind, and we'll basically eventually look at where you kind of tweak those. But like this one, as it's been sitting, it's reached SL9. For these sort of outside sort of renders, like usually 10 is really good, almost really good. If you really want high quality, you let it run to 12. Unless you have a lot of glass or refractions, that sort of fancy reflection stuff, then you might want to let it run a little bit more to 14, 15 if you have the time. Otherwise, I wouldn't worry too much about it, right? So this is what it looks like running in the background. Now, one thing I want to point out that it does is that, and this is actually the previous version, is that this is the Rhino file, and in the same folder where you have your Rhino file, let me change my to launch icons. Okay, in the same folder where you have your Rhino file, you'll actually see that it's saving this image as it goes, right? So you'll see that it's actually saving this as a PNG as it's updating each sample level. Okay, so this is what I mean. Like even if my computer were to crash right now, or my power went out, you would actually still have this image as a backup, right? So this is something that Maxwell Render does as it renders. At the same time, it saves two files. One of these, which is called a Maxwell image file, an MXI, and a Maxwell scene file called the MXS. I'll give you the details so you can see. So this is an MXS and this is an MXI. So the MXI is the one that basically you can resume a render on, and we'll show you how to do that a little later. But the MXS is basically your exported geometry in a format that Maxwell Render can read. Okay, and then there's a PNG file. Now you can actually ignore this first series, right? So basically, I have my Rhino file, and then whenever I hit render, it makes three files: an MXI, in MXS and the PNG image. And it continually updates these as it's rendered, as it goes. So right now it's SL11. So let's stop it. And it'll say writing output, blah, blah, and that's basically where it finalizes these things, okay? And so this will actually, this as a PNG will be, you know, the sort of latest, most up-to-date version of it, wherever your sample level stopped. We stopped at 11.72. Okay, so if we try to continue that rendering, you can either just continue from there, or I will actually just open a new Maxwell render sort of window by going to the start menu and finding it. This is the Maxwell render window. So you can go to File, Resume MXI right here, and go find that torus knot. You know, this is labeled automatically. You might not have this sort of number labeling, but open it. And it will say resume option, sample level to 25, how much time you want to allocate to it, say okay. And it will basically pick up where we left off, so 11.76, and it just, you know, resumes it, okay? Whenever you stop it, it will write back its progress into that same file. So if I let it run for a while, you know, maybe like get to 12, and then I stop it, then it will basically write in whatever rendering process it has into that same file. Now, one of the things you have to keep in mind though is to be able to resume a rendering, your scene file and the image file have to be in the same place. So these two files, they have to be together, right? The PNG image really doesn't matter because it'll just make a new one. But these two files, the scene and the image, have to be together. They have to be in the same place, or you can't have moved them since. Okay, so if I stop this, you'll see that it basically tries to go through a process of stopping, and it says output written, and then this gets updated as well. Okay, that's how the basic. You'll see there's a lot of output options that you can tweak, but this is the basic sort of idea behind the resuming. But I suggest that you kind of give it a shot and try it to get a sense for how it works, because you don't want to basically stop a render and then not be able to resume it. Okay? All right, so let's talk about Maxwell Fire a little bit. So remember in the plugin window, Scene Manager, that's, you know, where most of these settings are, blah, blah. The other one I said that we'll use is actually under rendering and export Maxwell Fire, right? So this is the sort of small preview window that gives you an idea of like what your rendering will look like in real time. So with the window open, you can enable the fire, all right, which starts this. And as you might remember, and actually let me close this, make it smaller. As you might remember, this basically updates in real time as you kind of move your scene around or you zoom into something, right? One thing you'll see this sort of blurring, right? And this is actually because I'm zoomed in really close to one thing. And remember that Maxwell cameras work very similarly to real cameras. So the sort of blurring or depth of field works very much the same way as you would if you had, you know, basically a macro camera shot zoomed in really close on a very small object. Now these are pretty small objects, I think. If you measure these are, you know, 1-inch cubes, right? So these in real scale, these are really, really tiny things. And so, you know, depending on your sort of point of view or how close you're zoomed into something, you'll see this sort of blurring happening in the background, which is sort of like what you call bokeh in a sort of real camera context or photography context, the sort of blurring of the background and having a sharp foreground image, which sometimes might be desirable, right? So the fire gives you a good idea of your final image. It's finished here, but you can actually set some of the settings. So if I right click, I can set the sample level threshold for the fire preview. So I can set higher or lower here. the image quality, and how many threads. But this is basically how many CPU cores or threads you will be dedicating to the Fire. Right? And you usually don't want this to be too high, because if you use all your cores, so like mine, I think I can go up to 8 on mine. It will basically use all your CPUs, right? So usually this is set to something like 4. I just wanted it faster, so I set it to 6, right? So you can right click and you can change these settings. The other interesting thing here, like you can save the image, or this image to clipboard or to disk. The other interesting here is this actually will superimpose the Fire image onto your model as well, onto your viewport. So if I move this out of the way, then I can actually do this as well. So you can actually see the preview in your viewport. It will just sort of copy it over. Obviously the quality isn't great, but this is another way of previewing it, and just click on it to disable it. Right? Now, as we mentioned before, the Fire preview will reflect, whatever changes you make in the viewport. So if I move this cube, then if I move things around, then things get updated, right? That's really simple and easy to understand. However, there are some things that don't update automatically in the Fire preview, and especially, let's see, let's say for this guy, if I stretch it, you'll see the Fire preview doesn't update, right? Because if there is a change in the meshed geometry, like this case, that won't actually get updated automatically. You will actually have to click on this thing to refresh it. Then it'll update, right? So any sort of geometric transformation, if you edit your geometry, you will have to refresh the Fire sort of window in order for those changes to apply, or basically get sort of passed over, right? Because Maxwell will actually have to remesh the stuff. If it's just moving things around though, right, or rotating things, these sort of translational rotations, well, actually this rotation didn't take either, so you'll have to refresh that else. But simple sort of movement of objects usually are updated automatically, as well as actually applying materials. So in this scene, I actually have a couple of materials already in here. So if you go to the scene manager and click on the first tab, which is the materials tab, you can see I have a couple of materials here. So you'll see that if I simply, let's say, drag and drop, so I'm clicking on it, this material, holding it down, highlighting it there, and letting it go, you'll see that it actually updates automatically, right? So for simple materials, it usually does this. This behavior will actually work, and you can actually just, you can actually do this. Okay. You'll see that the preview is taking a little longer to clear because these are all reflective, highly reflective material. You see the purple cube being reflected on the blue and vice versa, blah, blah. So, the preview will start to take longer to clear out, right? So you'll notice some of these things. Okay. Now this grass, if I try to apply it to this sort of ground plane, you'll see that it also basically gets updated automatically, or it takes automatically as well. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the functionality, how it can sort of help you iterate very quickly some of these ideas. But this is really and actually if you need to kind of refocus where you are, the best way to do it is actually just select an object and use the zoom select. And it will actually refocus your camera sort of focal range or focal point on, the front of whatever object you just zoom selected, right? and then you'll see the background actually in this case gets blurred out, so the part of your image that's in focus is actually here. Now this is usually an issue unless you're working with a really small scene like I am right now. But I have to use a really small scene to kind of show you how this works and how sort of to kind of exaggerate it. All right. So let's say you're happy with whatever shot or view you've set up now. So then you can close Fire. And obviously you can just press render here, but before we do that, you might actually want to come over to the output tab, and sometimes the output tab will take a little while to load. And you'll see that you can actually set a custom name for the output. So let's say Taurus ring. You can save it as different file formats, but usually I just stick with the PNG. You can specify a specific folder for it to be saved in if you don't want to. Well, basically, usually it just saves it in the same folder as your Rhino file, right? But if you want to specify a specific file, you can do that as well. So for now, I'll just put it on my desktop. And you can actually tell it to automatically append the camera name, which is useful. If you're just using that as a file name and you have, let's say perspective view 1, perspective view 2 as a sort of saved named view here, although I don't have it in this case, but you can actually append the camera name. So there's a lot of options here that I won't go into too much detail, but what I really want to talk about is this, right? So in the engine, there's a couple things you can look at. The first is the time and the sample level, right? So these are the limits where you will let, or Maxwell will render this until it stops, right? So either it hits sample level 25 first, or basically this is infinite, right? 9999 is basically goes forever. Threads and priority basically means how many CPU cores you want to dedicate to the rendering. So if you have a multi-core machine, then you can specify 6 cores, 7 cores. You can always leave 1 core for other tasks. For the priority for low, then that means, it will take, it will give you whatever you need to do your other stuff, and only take whatever is left over to do the rendering, right? So this is actually a good setting to use because, basically Maxwell will sort of figure out what other extra horsepower you have at the moment and use it. And if you need it back, then it will give it back to you. If you set to normal, then it will actually tie up those cores full time, right? So it's sort of up to you to decide. Threads priority, the threads, if you have it set to 0, that basically means that it will use all the threads that it can, or you can explicitly set 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8, whatever that you will dedicate to Maxwell render full time. So these are just some of the settings. Production is always probably just quality. The multi-light will go into this stuff will go into a little later when we get into some of the fancier options that are related to it. Okay, so these are just the ones you want to sort of concern yourself with for now. And let's hit render, and it'll pop up. So you'll see that this is a much more close-up image. Using the scroll, your middle mouse scroll button, you can kind of zoom in and out of the image. There is a place, where does it, that shows you the percentage of its size. Oh, here, zoom on the lower right. It will tell you, okay, right now I'm zoomed in 100%. So this is the size of the image really, as well as some of the other options. You also have the sort of small preview window here. And you can also remember that besides the render options here, and yours actually might be in a different place, so you will have to look for it. You can click on the camera tab here, and remember that you can also, at this point, you can also begin to dynamically change, how bright the image is. the ISO and the shutter settings, and they will update into the scene if you want. Okay. So this image basically looks very much like a sort of macro camera shot because the objects in the background are sort of blurred out. And that basically brings me to one of these, which is the one that is one of these pages. And these links I will provide in the module as well, so you can look at it. But basically, this sort of description of depth of field, focal distance, and the camera target, right? So you might have to manipulate this in those sort of scenes where you're like basically rendering a very close up or macro close up objects, narrow versus wide depth of field. But in particular, the sort of relationship between the f-stop and your result. So this is actually the best example of it. This is an interactive sort of thing. So if you hover your mouse over it, it will show you that if you have your f-stop low, sort of value to something that's really low, basically and this is changing the focal distance. So things that are not within that plane will be out of focus, and if I move it to the right and my f-stop value goes high to like 11, for example, in this case, then my focal depth becomes really, really deep, right? So most of the image is in focus. The smaller or the lower my f-stop goes, the wider my aperture is, then your sort of depth of field gets narrower, right? So parts of it will blur out, parts of it will, right? If I'm focused on the background, the foreground blurs out. If I'm focused on the foreground, the background blurs out, right? So this kind of gives you a good idea of that relationship between focal distance and shutter speed, or f-stop, or your basically what's called the EV values. And this is the sort of example of bokeh, or basically rendering with objects in focus or out of focus. Okay? These are very basic sort of technical descriptions that tells you what's happening, but these are just sort of good to know, so you can realize or sort of recognize what's happening when you see it. Okay, so this rendering was just while we were sort of talking. I'll let it run a little bit. It's just a couple minutes, right? SL8 right now, and this is roughly what you'll get. And because I told it to save the export to my desktop, instead of that the same file as the Rhino file, right now all these images are actually being saved to the desktop, which includes, if you want to take a look, which includes Torus perspective, the PNG file, the MXS file, and the MXI file. And these are the ones that are being sort of saved at the basically at the same time, right? So the PNG file, and you'll see that it appends automatically the camera view, right? Which is perspective, because I had this checked, the camera name. All right. So that's it for the first video. This is just like a very generic, basic overview. And we'll get into some of the more specifics really in the next ones.